What's going on, you guys? Come on in, make yourself at home. We're about to start a brand new episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. And as always, if you want to follow along live on the show, I do go live at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern Time on the weekends on this show called Jimmy Rants. I do it primarily over on Instagram Live. I also simulcast on 2 Facebook pages. But go follow me over on Instagram at Livin' Low Carb Man, LivinLowCarbMan. And you can watch it live. We'd love to have you engage, just like I will engage with the people watching now in just a few minutes. You can also watch all the past episodes over at JimmyRants.com. That's the primary place you can access them. Last year I got hacked on my, or no, not hacked, I got deleted, on my YouTube channel because I did a Jimmy Rants about parking lot suicides, and they saw the word suicides and they yanked the video and then yanked my account and said I was promoting suicide. And what? So JimmyRants.com will never get yanked, I promise you. So definitely check it out there. But it is back on YouTube again. They did reinstate me about a month later. So you can just type in a keyword Jimmy Rants over at YouTube and you'll find the past episodes there. But thank you for being here. If you've been watching lately, then you know I've been talking a lot about this COVID-19 coronavirus and how to mentally handle it, how to deal with some of the fallout that's happening as a result of it. I've been doing a lot of those kind of rants lately. But today I want to shift back into doing some house stuff because I feel like people want some familiarity. You want to know, okay, we're kind of on a pause right now in the world, but the world is still going on. I mean, think about all the things that are still happening. You're still getting your bills. You're still having responsibilities, and there's still things happening that were happening long before this thing came along. And one of those things is this is 2020. There's a lot of things happening this year, including the Dietary Guidelines Committee with the United States Department of Agriculture. They're putting together the 2020 Dietary Guidelines, and these will be basically the law of the land as it relates to nutrition for the next 5 years. So those are supposed to still come down by the end of the year, and I've got some news, you guys, that may not make you very happy about what's happening. Because I did a recent Jimmy Rants before all the coronavirus came out about how this group of scientists and researchers and former members of the Dietary Guidelines Committee all got together at a symposium, and they came to the conclusion that there's just such overwhelming evidence for low-carb ketogenic nutrition that they need to at least put it on the table and put it into the guidelines somehow, some way. And so I put that out there, and then next thing we know, and this is according to lowcarbaction.org, the Dietary Guidelines Committee now is choosing to ignore the low-carb research. Now let that soak in for a second. We have been begging them forever. Like, I've been online blogging since 2005. So that year they were putting out dietary guidelines. I was not as into that then as I am now. 2010, I did go testify before the USDA Dietary Guidelines Committee. There was 87 people testifying. Of 330 million people, 87 total people testified before this committee. 2 people, myself and one lady that just happened to be on vacation in Washington, D.C., we were real people that were deciding to give testimony, asking them to listen to what we have to say. That lady, by the way, she was the very first speaker, and she said, we need to be pushing people to eat real food. That was her overriding message. And I'm like, you go, girl. If we just got people to eat real food and encouraged real food, we wouldn't have all these games with the eating healthy whole grains and da-da-da. Just eat real food. So then I remember getting up there, and if you've read my book, Keto Clarity, you know in the introduction, I tell this story about how I get up there, and I didn't have any notes. All these people were from industry. There were various researchers. There were various people, and all of them stood before this committee and read their comments. And I'm sitting there going, okay, I know why they're doing that because it goes into the public record. But if you're going to sit there and read to me, the committee, they were just like, they were just like so overwhelmed by the boringness of it all. So then I get up there and I'm not looking at any notes. I'm looking at those committee members right in their eyes. And I'm saying, you know, all the advice you've given us in these dietary guidelines for so many years has failed me miserably. And it wasn't until I started doing the exact opposite of what you told me to do in these guidelines that I finally started getting healthy. And I remember Jeff Volek was one of the people, he's one of the researchers in the low-carb realm. He was one of the people that was there testifying as well. And he said, when you were talking, Jimmy, nobody was looking down or bored or doodling or anything. They were staring at you because I was real. And that's really what we need right now to wake these people up. Real life examples. So many of us have seen such incredible benefits in our weight and our health as a result of eating real food that nourishes our body, that's lower in carbohydrate, eating healthy fats, not vilifying those things in our diet anymore. Now, it didn't make a hill of beans difference in the 2010 dietary guidelines, but in the 2015 dietary guidelines, it was the first time they ever said dietary cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern. Now, for the longest time, they tell you to limit your cholesterol intake because you're worried about clogging your arteries, blah, 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 blah. Well, they finally removed that in the 2015 dietary guidelines. Again, never really making a big deal about it because they're trying to slowly back into correcting the mistakes of their past. They realized they took far too draconian steps before, and now they're even trying a little bit to back away from the restrictions on saturated fat. But they can't do that without looking like fools, and they are terrified. Believe me when I say this, the reason the dietary guidelines have not shifted in a more low-carb, ketogenic, real food kind of direction is they risk and fear great backlash from people. Don't doubt me on this one, you guys. The reason they have not embraced the low-carb research and they're not really interested in it is keeping the status quo keeps them safe from a civil class action lawsuit. Don't doubt me on this, guys. I think this and I believe this for many years. Why don't they, in the face of such overwhelming evidence, embrace this and give people this at least as an option? The reason is if they make it out there and they say, oh, you know, all that stuff we told you before, do the opposite, they fear a great class action lawsuit from this, which is a ridiculous reason for slowing what we know the science is showing. But that's my theory. That's what I think is happening here. They don't want the blowback that would come from them reversing positions on things like saturated fat, or telling you, you know, all those healthy whole grains we told you to eat, yeah, they're far more inflammatory than we ever imagined. So you might want to back off of those. They're not going to do that. It's far more comfortable for them to keep pushing what they've always pushed. Well, we've always pushed this. Meanwhile, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, all the cardiometabolic diseases of our day keep getting worse and worse and worse. And they back themselves into a corner because the healthcare system is overrun. Never mind the coronavirus thing right now. Let's pretend like all gets better from that, and it will eventually. But chronic disease is not going away. And it's because these guidelines keep getting pushed under the guise that they've been fully vetted out by research and scientists, to the point that they get parroted by dietitians and nutritionists and personal trainers and doctors and teachers and you name it, people in positions of authority when it comes to your nutrition. The way they could solve this and save face and not fear the class action lawsuit, I'm going to get to this article in a second, but you got me on a rant right now, so I'm going to rant away, is to offer various options. So keep the same dietary guidelines diet. If you like that diet, USDA, go ahead and put that one out. but say, you know what, for the first time in the history of the dietary guidelines, we want to give you a vegan option. Here's how you do it well. A keto option. Here's how you do it well. A Mediterranean option. Here's how you do it well. And then our option of what we always do, and here's how you do it well. I think the problem comes into play when it becomes this one-size-fits-all solution, and there is no one size that fits all when it comes to your diet. That's why so many of us have gravitated to things like keto, because we've been frustrated by the failure of all those other things that were supposed to be the right diet. And we did the right diet for years. We obediently cut our calories. We obediently cut our fat. And where did it get us? Nowhere. So that's the way they save face. Oh yeah, we still recommend these things, but here's some other things that you might want to try. And then you let people decide. Nobody's going to have a class action lawsuit if you do that. All right, let me get to the meat of this story. Again, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the 2020 Dietary Guidelines. Yes, the coronavirus thing is still going on, but don't think things aren't happening behind the scenes as it relates to these dietary guidelines, which are due out by the end of the year, by the way. And this story is on lowcarbaction.org. It's by Dr. Ted Eyton, E-Y-T-A-N. He's a medical doctor with this organization, Low Carb Action. And he writes in the headline, Dietary Guidelines Committee appears to ignore the vast majority of low-carb studies. As you may know, the process for the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans for the first time included a formal review of low-carb diets. So, they never really looked at the low-carb research before this year. This is the first time they've really taken a close look at it. Now, it's been put on their radar screen. I've been a part of the 2010 and 2015 ones where we were pushing people to share all the research, and all the leading researchers in the ketogenic world were sending them all the studies they've been doing, and it's mostly randomized control clinical trials. They're really good quality studies and not epidemiological studies. And so they've been looking at that this year for the first time really closely. However, as the guidelines process has progressed, with the last meeting that happened earlier this month, it happened like the first week of March, and then all you know what broke loose with this coronavirus the next week, and we've all been kind of quarantined ever since. There is serious reason to doubt that low-carb diets will ever be properly reviewed or even reviewed at all. So they promised that they would take a look. And they've broken that promise. Now, why are we surprised? I mean, look at who puts out these guidelines. The United States Department of Agriculture. Why do we ever believe that the USDA has the best interests of the health of the American people when they put out these guidelines? And by extension, the world, because these guidelines then become the basis for all the guidelines around the world. They only have agriculture in mind. They want to keep all those people growing corn real happy and fat, all with government subsidies kind of buying up all of these commodities. They don't want you to not eat corn and not eat soy and not eat all of these crops that they're literally paying farmers through the nose to grow. They're cheap. They're able to make them into food-like products. I call them food-like disease agents, all the crappy garbage that's out there. And they use that. And so if they come out in the guidelines and they take a really serious look at what these carbohydrates that they have been paying for is actually doing to the health of people, they know what it's doing to people. Let's not pretend like they don't know the ramifications of what all these carbohydrates that people are eating is having on their health. We see it in the statistics of the obesity epidemic. We see it in the statistics of heart disease and cancer and type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, you name it. All of those are metabolic diseases. And the sooner we come to the conclusion that metabolic disease is happening as a direct result of excessive carbohydrate consumption, that's where we need to be. And that's where a lot of us have gotten to on our own. We didn't need the government to tell us. And a lot of times people will say, well, we don't care about the dietary guidelines. Nobody pays attention. It's not about paying attention, guys. It's about knowing that they become the basis for what doctors teach patients about nutrition. Well, dietary guidelines say da 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 da. What dietitians teach, nutritionists, even personal trainers, they all point to that. Then, if you're on food stamps and you're on WIC kind of benefits from the government, you kind of have to be forced to buy things within this as well. Public schools also have to follow the guidelines of the dietary guidelines in making the meals that they have. That's why your kid has to have a piece of bread or whole grain pasta or something on their plate. See the ramifications. And then the commissaries on military bases are also based on this. Guys, the tentacles of the dietary guidelines for Americans run deeper than any of us really know. And so when they come out and they say, well, we're going to look at the low carb research, but then they don't, it's a slap in the face to all of us who believe that low carb nutrition is the basis for being healthy. And that's what they're doing here. They're basically just saying, we don't care about you. And here's the realization you need to come to. The dietary guidelines have never been about your health. Nope. They haven't. And trust me, I've battled this in my own head for many years. If the dietary guidelines were about health, they would embrace the research that supports things that are healthy. And it's extremely obvious they're missing the insulin and blood sugar connection. They're missing the inflammation connection to disease. Because if they did, if they understood that, there's no way they could push all the carbs that they do. I mean, I know they changed to the food plate a few years back, but that food plate still has a gob of carbohydrate in it. Yes, it's got a modicum of protein, and that's great. Very little fat, though. There's hardly any fat in it. And so we're telling people to eat a super low-fat diet, lots of protein, whole lot of carbohydrate. And to what end? Is that succeeding? Have we had this long enough to go, reverse course? You know, if we were a business, the dietary guidelines was a business, it would have failed miserably many years ago. It would have gone bankrupt. It's not succeeding. It's doing just the opposite. It's not making health better. It's making health worse. Right? The Low Carb Action Network has been concerned about this approach to low carb studies from the start when the committee announced its protocols for reviewing the science. These protocols inaccurately described what the low carb diet was. They actually describe anything, 45% of your diet as carbohydrate. That's their starting point for a low carb diet. Guys, I don't remember the last time I had almost half of my calories coming from carbs. It's easily 2004 when I lost my weight, or before 2003 before I lost my weight, was the last time I had that many carbohydrates as a percentage of the total calories consumed. But they say, it's 45% of calories coming from carbohydrate. Oh, that's low carb. No, it is not. I promise you. Now, I don't think you have to be ketogenic in order to be low carb, but I think if we're going to talk about a low carb diet, I would think that, and they put it in here as well, the science clearly shows a true low carb diet will be well under 25% of calories coming from carbs. So they already start off with a bad definition of what low carb means, and don't doubt me on this, that's by design. Remember, U.S. Department of Agriculture, if we can say, 45%, that's low carb. They can still push you those grains. They can still push you that corn, that soy, all of the crops that make them lots of money. Don't doubt me on this. That's why they define it. They're trying to co-opt what low carb means when the real low carb is under 25%. Once you start getting that low as a percentage of your total calories consumed, of carbohydrates, it's hard to get some of those things that they want you to be eating. So by using this incorrect definition, as they have done, it will water down and obscure the significant health benefits that are found for all of us that are doing a true low carb diet. Thus, it provides inaccurate and unreliable information to the public. So the public hears, let's just say, for some miraculous reason, they decide to promote low carb in the dietary guidelines. Well, guess what? They're going to define what that means. And they're going to say, oh, 45%. Don't go too far below 45% because that gets really wacky. That K word will come up and it'll damage your brain. And don't doubt me on this. If they ever put low carb in the dietary guidelines, read the fine print, because what they're describing as low carb is anything but it. It reminds me of when I was in the paleo community, and I started talking about keto then, and I came out with Keto Clarity while paleo was still at its height. And I remember I was moderating a panel that had 2 keto people on there and 2 paleo people on there. And I remember the paleo people, oh yeah, we are all for keto, but done in the right way. And I'm like, what does that mean? Oh, well, if you drink high doses of MCT oil while you're having all these paleo-friendly carbs like tapioca starch and sweet potato and safe starches like white potatoes and white rice, get lots of MCT oil, that will keep your ketones going, and that's a ketogenic diet. I'm like, screw that. That is not what we're talking about here. But they were trying to co-opt the name keto, much in the same way that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is trying to adopt their own version of what low carb is. Words mean things. Don't let anybody ever co-opt what our words mean. So in that same meeting that happened a few weeks ago, they revealed several ways in which the committee is misunderstanding or excluding scientific evidence on low carb. Most notably, they have not finished all the review of the low carb diets, and they did not announce any conclusions that came out of what they had learned up to that point. In the meeting, the same statement was made 3 times. The full body of evidence is still currently under review. So they said that many times. So they've been looking at on obesity, as it relates to cardiovascular disease, and then on diabetes, 3 of the top kind of lifestyle diseases that we're dealing with. This means the review will be conducted outside the public view, so nobody will be able to hear what they're discussing. It should be open so that everybody can hear and then make comment on. There's also no opportunity for a public comment on the conclusions prior to the publication of the scientific report. So the first time you'll find out what they did with low carb as it relates to the 2020 dietary guidelines will be pretty much when the guidelines come out. Guys, that is sad. That's like what happens very often on Capitol Hill when there is a bill that's trying to get passed. And a lot of times they say, well, you'll find out what's in it once you pass it. And I'm going, what? Like, how does that happen? But it happens more often than not, and that seems to be what the Dietary Guidelines Committee is doing. Number 2, the committee also excluded any studies on weight loss. Let that sink in for a moment. They did not want to look at any low-carb studies that took a look at the weight loss benefits of it. Isn't the reason we're trying to get people to eat better is so they can lose weight and get healthier? Isn't that the whole reason why we're having dietary guidelines to begin with? So if it is, why would they be excluding the weight loss studies? This exclusion means that a wide swath of relevant literature was completely removed from consideration. We know that much of the reason for studying low-carb diets has been due to its weight loss potential. And so if weight loss potential is what we're looking at, why, pray tell, would we leave that kind of research out? Doesn't make sense, does it? Number 3, the committee also excluded all studies below 25.3% of carbs as energy. What? Like a lot of the ketogenic research, you guys, a lot of the ketogenic research is well under 25.3%. That's an odd number, by the way. Why did they choose 25.3? Why not 21.7? It's just weird. But most of the ketogenic research, carbohydrate intake could be as low as 3 to 5% of your total calories for the day. And we're talking about total carbohydrates. So they wanted to define very narrowly what low carb means. 25.3 to 45% is considered low carb. Committee member Dr. Carol Bushi stated, no studies meeting inclusion criteria examined carbohydrate distribution below 25.3%, but the database with the Low Carb Action Group has 52 studies that could have been included, but due to their inappropriately restrictive exclusion criteria, their review of low-carb studies will therefore be based on only a small fraction of what's actually in the literature. Guys, again, this is not by accident. They want no part whatsoever of the ketogenic diet. Don't doubt me on that one either. Because when you have 25.3% of calories coming from carbohydrate, it's pretty darn hard to get in ketosis. Like, let's do that with a 2,000 calorie diet. That's 500 calories worth of carbohydrate. 500 divided by 4 is 125, so 125 grams of carbohydrate. But again, you know why they're not going below that? It's very simple. See, when you put the pieces together, it makes sense what these numbskulls on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee are doing. The reason they want that is they think that's how many grams of carbs you need to eat to have brain function. They're still stuck on your brain being a glucose-dependent organ that cannot run on anything but glucose. And I did a Jimmy Rants recently all about this. Your brain can do just fine with the very small amounts of glucose it would get from gluconeogenesis from the protein you eat, a little bit of carbs if you have those, but even those of us that eat more of a carnivore diet, that protein is giving you all the glucose you need for the glucose-dependent functions in your brain. But the brain and other parts of the body thrive on ketone bodies. And so they know by limiting the research that they're examining to the 25.3%, they know it's almost impossible for you to reach that threshold where you would get into ketosis. They want to avoid the K word at all costs. Number 4, the committee suggested that the dietary guidelines might not even address low-carb diets at all. In an exchange between committee members, again, this happened on March the 13th, so right as all this coronavirus stuff was happening, March 13th, they had this meeting. Dr. Stephen Himesfield remarked, things like high versus low carbohydrate diets, keto diets, time-restricted feeding, which is intermittent fasting, these are all issues we didn't deal with, at least in the committee that I was on, 2 committees I was on, and I just wonder, I know you don't want to take up a lot of space in that document, but I think these are topics that are hard to ignore, and I think a lot of people in the public are interested in them. Yeah, look at what's been the hottest diet trend the last 5 years. It's keto, and it's fasting, and now it's carnivore. Very important issues to look at. In response, the chair for the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, Dr. Barbara Sheenman, she said, we need to acknowledge those comments and acknowledge our discussion. While we haven't been the body to look at the evidence, there are other federal agencies that could be. If it's not the dietary guidelines, where else can it be dealt with? So she's trying to pass the buck. And yet she's the chairwoman of the very committee that's going to determine over the next 5 years in the United States and pretty much around the world, because everybody mimics us, that's going to determine how we eat to be healthy. And yet she's like, well, there must be some, please, anybody else take this hard thing from me because I don't want to have to deal with this. Where else would it be? FDA? But what does the FDA have control over? What would they determine? No, the dietary guidelines, if they're going to be in a government institution and they're going to come out with these guidelines every 5 years, you're at the right place at the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, right? So, is it possible that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee will ignore low-carb diets altogether? Given the exclusion of relevant research and a possible move to not review the studies at all, it's time to make your voices heard. So they are putting out a call at lowcarbaction.org to make your voice heard. We need to have low carb be an option for people. A true low-carb diet, not one that's limited to 25.3% to 45%. It can be well below that for some people. Not everybody needs to go super duper low in carbs, but there is a segment of the population that does. A lot of people with insulin resistance right now. If you have insulin resistance and you're not restricting your carbohydrate to well under 50 grams of total carbohydrate in a day, you're doing your body a disservice. You are. This would be a bad outcome for Americans dealing with obesity, prediabetes, heart disease, diabetes, and more, who could all benefit from a much lower carb ketogenic option. The members and friends can contact your members of Congress to ask them to work on the Dietary Guidelines Committee to do its work properly. In the congressional mandate with the Dietary Guidelines, they are to, quote, be the best and most current science. Well, it's obvious they're already kind of litmus testing what can be good science and what could be bad science, and that's horrible. These non-scientists on this Dietary Guidelines Committee are making determination of what is good science and bad science. I get it, they're the experts in their field, but let's not also forget that they're highly influenced. They were appointed to this committee, and a lot of them were appointed because, well, they're going to keep the status quo. I hate to be so jaded about this, but I remember back in the day, 2010, I pushed really hard. I blogged about it. I podcasted about it. I had him on my podcast, and we were pushing him hard to get Dr. Eric Westman on those Dietary Guidelines Committee advisory committee. Pushed him hard. Got a bunch of people to write to the USDA. Hey, seriously consider, here's all the evidence that he's presented in the scientific literature. He can offer a very analytical mind when it comes to reading research. And they just flat out was like, nope. Doesn't fit our little puppet opening that we want to put in there. And you have to know that, you guys. They pretend like these are the top people in their field, and they are very well respected and well known, so don't get me wrong, but they're definitely hand chosen for a purpose and a reason. So looking at the best and most current science is not possible under the current time restraints. It's also time to reevaluate this process so that comprehensive scientific studies can be done. So they were supposed to meet again on March 27th. I'm not sure what the coronavirus is doing with that timetable. They probably will do it virtually with like a Zoom call. But they're encouraging people at the low-carb action group, low-carb-action.org. They're encouraging you to tell your members of Congress that they're ignoring the science. And so they want people to compose a message. So if you go to votervoice.net, there should be a low-carb action page, but or go to low-carb-action.org. Both places will have where you can write to your congressman. So they tell you they give you kind of a template about how you can do it, but you give them your name, your email, your phone number, whether you're a health professional or not, what your education is, what your profession is, and your address. So that's what's happening there. Now, behind the scenes, I am a part of an email chain from a lot of the people in the low-carb keto space. And a lot of us are talking about this on a very open level. You probably know Nina Teicholz is out there with her group, nutritioncoalition.org. Trying to influence the dietary guidelines as well to at least look at the science. And this is the bottom line in all this. We just want them to look at what the science is showing. That's it. Like, let's stop pretending like the science doesn't have strong evidence for low-carb diets, and yet they pretend like they stick their fingers in their ear, la, 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 don't want to hear, la, 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 la. And that doesn't make the science that's solid go away. So they're going to have to come to terms with that. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of people talking about this, and one of the influencers, I won't say the name, but they wrote this. Please understand we have a fundamental disconnect between how low-carb diets are typically used as an intervention in a clinical setting for a diagnosed condition such as obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and what the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is meant to do, which is to provide guidance to prevent disease that applies to an entire population. I fully understand that our population is not a healthy one, and so the idea of preventing disease is largely closing the door after the horse has already left the barn, and that the dietary guidelines are currently used as a default intervention in many cases who are treated through the public health lens, and that the dietary guidelines has been expressing the scope creep in the past few editions, suggesting that they should be used not just for healthy people, but also to the overweight and obese. Stick with me because this is good. The dietary guidelines lean heavily on epidemiology when it comes to nutrition and as it relates to chronic disease to justify their recommendations. Thus, that's how they get to eat healthy whole grains. It's how they get to red meat and saturated fat is bad. Only epidemiology shows you those conclusions. If you look at the actual randomized controlled interventional type of trials and studies that are out there, they show nothing of the sort, but they're relying heavily on epidemiology. No such studies exist to support the kind of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction which most of us are familiar with. If you eat somewhere between 20 to 50 grams a day of carbohydrate, which is typical of what's used in the good studies about keto and low-carb diets, and you can show people all the positive benefits from that. But here's what happens. When we tell people that we have clinical trials that show low-carb helps with diabetes or some other disease, they will say, well, we're not trying to present a diet that will treat people dealing with diabetes and metabolic disease with our public health guidelines. You see how they can take all of the arguments that we have and say, well, that's not our purpose. That's not our intention here. So that's one. When we say we have clinical trials that show low carb is way better for weight loss, but the longer term studies show, this is what they were saying in response, long-term studies show little difference between low carb and low fat, which is true. They do show that. The problem with those studies is they only let them or mandate them to eat their diet for 6 months. And then after that, they're like, eat whatever you want. Well, people go back to eating their normal diet again. And of course, the weight loss is going to be even after a year. Nobody has ever done a study where they make them be on a low-fat diet for a year and they make them be on a ketogenic diet for a year, and then you compare the weight loss to those two things. That, as far as I know, that's never, ever been done. Almost all of these studies, they have them be on the intervention, low carb or low fat, for a certain period of time. Sometimes it's 3 months. The longest I think I've seen is 6 months. But then they give them like a 6-month washout period where, okay, whatever you learned from your last 6 months, go. And what they find is by the end of the study, it's the exact same diet. Both the low-fat people started eating a lot more fat. The low-carb people started eating a lot more carbs. And when you look at what they actually eat, they're eating the exact same kind of nutritional breakdown, macronutrients and calories, which should be no surprise. They didn't lose any different weight. But if you look just in that like 6-month period, low carb was far superior to a low fat diet. It has been. When we say, can't we also have low carb as part of public health guidance, they will say, well, saturated fat and sodium and red meat that is allowed on these diets is very dangerous. We just know that. We know because we have all these long-term nutritional epidemiological studies on chronic disease to show this. And so you see how all of the ways we try to make hay with the research and science that we do have that says this is why they need to pay attention to low carb. You see how this astute influencer behind the scenes is saying, hey, look, they're going to counter every bit of it. So then what do we do? How do we make the case for low carb and that they should be included if they're going to use all those as excuses? So here's how it was concluded. I think if we're going to expect changes, we need to speak to them in their own language. We do have a lot of evidence that saturated fat caps are not supported by the science. Even the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee itself uses this. They had emails sent by the 2015 Dietary Guidelines to support this. In other words, publicly they're telling you still cut your saturated fat. Behind the scenes in their communications, they're like, we really don't have any evidence of capping saturated fat at any given level. It's a confliction, guys. And if you know about the confliction, then when you see the final results, I hope to God, when the 2020 dietary guidelines come out, they do something in a positive direction with saturated fat. Just like they did in 2015 with cholesterol, it's no longer a nutrient of concern. They need to do something similar with saturated fat this time. But again, the fear of a class action lawsuit is just dominating every thought process right now. Another tactic that we could do is to highlight and potentially remove this disconnect would go a long way towards making low-carb diets more acceptable across the board. We could emphasize low-carb diets don't necessarily involve an increased consumption of red meat or saturated fat, but I suspect that this group would be less enthusiastic about that approach, talking about the behind-the-scenes group. I'm not sure if it would remove us from the merry-go-round of rhetoric. And this is the thing, you guys. All of this is just pure, unadulterated rhetoric. Because if common sense prevailed and people were actually looking at this with a goal in mind of what's the best practice for the general public to be eating generally healthy, nobody in their right mind would have them eat the kind of carbohydrate consumption that people are eating right now. And here's what happens when you confuse the crap out of people and you don't give them some clear message when it relates to the nutrition. What do people default to? Well, if you're going to bicker and argue about it, that it doesn't matter how we eat, blah, 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 then I'm just going to eat my junk food and I'll be happy. And that's where we are in 2020 with our diet. So don't think just because we're all holed up in our houses with the coronavirus and socially isolating and distancing ourselves from one another and being encouraged to stay home, that nothing's happening with the dietary guidelines for 2020. They are still happening, you guys. And this is coming out later this year. Even as we're so consumed by the news cycle of what's happening right now, don't neglect that this is still going on and that it's going to have an impact on your life for at least the next 5 years in a lot of ways that maybe you hadn't thought about before. All right, let's see what you guys have to say. We're going to go to Instagram Live first, and if we have time, we'll come to Facebook Live. And just a reminder, Facebook, Living La Vida Low Carb Facebook page, I can't see your comments, so I can't comment to you, but I will look at your comments after we're done here. So welcome in, you guys. Thanks for being here. JimmyRants.com is the website. And go check it out. Holistic Ketosis says, got to keep those people sick or they'll be losing out. Well, I've had that jaded position for years, and deep down inside, I just don't want to be that skeptical, but I think you have no choice but to believe it because they are outright ignoring solid science that we know supports a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. They're just ignoring that science and they don't care. Living your authentic life. Yes, dietary guidelines run the U.S. pretty much. It's not just a picture of a food pyramid or a food plate at this point. Exactly. She said, follow the money trail. Again, I don't want to be that jaded, but the longer I live and the longer I observe all this, it's just so, it's frustrating. Let's just put it that way. Bonnie says, you and I talked about my higher cholesterol on keto and the doctor wanting me on meds. My heart test was 0, lost 40 pounds, triglycerides in a great range. Doctor says, oh, you're at high risk because of keto. And I said, what? Yeah. All right, B. Parkman, you have a great question. And I've done this before several times. In fact, I recently did a Jimmy Rants where I talked about epidemiology. So epidemiological studies. This is where scientists take a look at previous studies that all kind of looked at similar kinds of things. And so whenever you see a headline that says, study, red meat causes cancer and increases all-cause mortality. So you see like an inflammatory type of headline like that. Then you go into the actual story and you see a study of 68,000 men. That's your clue that it's a crappy study. And you're thinking, wow, how can that be a crappy study? It's 68,000 people. Surely that means something. Actually, in the world of science, the smaller the number of study participants, the more reliable the data is. And that seems weird, but think of it this way. These researchers that are doing epidemiological studies, they're observing data on a piece of paper that some other studies have done. Now, keep in mind, some of those studies that are a part of an epidemiological study, some of those studies are flawed. Some of them had way bad research protocol. And so when you have research protocol that's all messed up, and then you throw it into an epidemiological study, it's kind of like filling up a glass of water with toilet water, or a glass with toilet water, and then you pour a little bit of the toilet water into the next glass, and then you put some fresh water, and then that one you pour a little bit more, and you see how it dilutes it? You're still not going to drink the original water or any of the aforementioned waters, but they're all crap at that point. You wouldn't drink it. And it's the same way with epidemiology. They're going to put some bad science in there. But then they're only observing data. What the good research is, and I did this in the back of my book, Keto Clarity, we talked about how to read research. And again, Dr. Eric Westman was my co-author on that book. He is one of the world's renowned researchers on ketogenic diets. He knows research methodology about as well as anybody. And he will tell you the gold standard is a randomized, controlled, double-blind placebo study. That's how you do good quality research. The problem with that research is it's extraordinarily expensive. I remember Gary Taubes, when he wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories, he was talking about doing a really good quality randomized controlled trial. An RCT is what they call that. And he said, for us to do a really good one that would compare low fat, low carb, it would cost $100 million, minimum $100 million, because you're talking about locking people up in a metabolic ward for a period of time of upwards of a year. You got to pay those people. You got to do all the tests. You want to do all these measures. And you would only be able to do it with maybe like 100 people. I think I've seen some randomized controlled trials that have like upwards of maybe 300 people, but you need a modicum of people in order for it to work, because you're going to have dropout rates, and so you got to account for that. All of these things matter, and so epidemiology is leaned on a lot. So when you see an inflammatory headline, 99% of the time, if it's saying something so crazy it doesn't seem believable, look at how many study participants it is, and it's usually well over 10,000, and that's garbage when it comes to research. Yes, it shows you trends. Yes, it shows you something you can test in a randomized controlled trial, but it in and of itself has no human application whatsoever. Kat says the majority of people still prefer a pill over lifestyle, so carbs way too addictive to try to give it all up, and cheap, and they're shelf stable. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people keep going back to their carbs, and that's going to be a constant battle. It's why I do my work, trying to help people overcome that addiction and get what all those carbs are doing to them. All right, thank you for that over there on Instagram. I'm going to come over to my Facebook page now. Hey, guys. Let's see what we got. A friend of mine, mother died a year ago. I had the day planned, was planning on sending her flowers, going to lunch to graveyard, just spending the day with her, not able to order flowers, none available. Aw, sorry to hear that. I hope your day gets better. Dietary guidelines should be to promote good health. Maria, it seems so well duh. I mean, if you ask the average American, what do you think the purpose of the dietary guidelines is? They're going to probably invariably tell you, help you lose weight and get healthy. Like, isn't that what we've always believed? Isn't that the whole point? I remember when the first ones came out in 1980. I was 8 years old. Yeah, I was 8 years old in 1980. And I remember being in elementary school at the time, and they made us memorize the food pyramid. And, you need like 12 to 16 servings of grains a day to be healthy. Minimize the amount of fat you consume. They propagandized us to no end. Then I'd come home and see my overweight mom going on low-fat diet after low-fat diet after low-fat diet. She had the rice cakes and the the diet fat-free cream cheese. The one that got me the most was she would eat peaches and fat-free cottage cheese. And to this day, I still can't bring myself to eat cottage cheese or peaches because they just remind me too much of my mom's low-fat days. Dietary guidelines don't want to look at the science because they don't want to prevent disease and promote optimum health. Whose side are they really on? I don't think they're on anybody's good side, if we're being honest. It's sad where we are with the dietary guidelines. Amber said it's all so frustrating. It is, Amber. But the thing is, those of us in this space, we've learned. And when you know better, you do better. And we're all doing better. See, this is the part about the keto trend that's so fascinating to me, that it can't have an impact on our culture as it relates to the dietary guidelines. I get it. They're trying to keep it very scientific. But you can't deny that there has literally been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who have seen a benefit from being on a low-carb ketogenic diet just over the past few years. Just since the last dietary guidelines in 2015, look at all the massive numbers of people that have started keto and have cleaned up their diet. We know people are eating it because the amount of Coca-Cola being sold is far less. Donut companies are seeing profit losses. All the junk food companies are starting to feel a little bit of a pinch. So let's not pretend like people aren't making major changes on their own, whether the Dietary Guidelines Committee is recommending it or not. They are. And so if they are, they need to pay attention. We might all be just a bunch of N equals ones, but if you put us all together, we're N equals everybody. And if we kind of put together, and I know somebody was working on a website that was putting together all the people that have seen success eating kind of a lower carb type of diet, you could easily get a database of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who have improved their weight, improved their health, gotten off of medications, all just from shifting their nutrition. And the sooner the Dietary Guidelines Committee understands this, the better. Now, I still hold out that there's no way the dietary guidelines will ever be legit scientific until they're outside the purveyorship of a government entity. So the United States Department of Agriculture makes no sense. The Department of Health and Human Services does make sense, but they're kind of abdicating their role more to the Agriculture Department. Who should come into play is the FDA and the Health and Human Services. Food and Drug Administration. They're the ones that are kind of looking at. Now, I don't think they're any better, but if we're going to have it under some government institution, let it be the FDA and the HHS, not the USDA, Department of Agriculture. What do we think they're going to promote? My idea is remove it from government altogether, put it totally to a third-party group, bring in the leading experts in all of these fields. That includes ones that conflict with the ones that are a part of the current guidelines. And let's have a posse. Let's see what we do agree on. What can we all come together and say, these are healthy practices? And if we don't have one consensus on healthy practices, we could even compartmentalize it and say, okay, well, if you want to try this, here is how to do this particular thing well. You want to do this, here's how to do this particular thing well. Give people kind of a potpourri of choices. And you give them choices, they try one, that didn't work. You try the next one. The problem now is you get a one-size-fits-all dietary guidelines, you try it, it fails, and you're like, now what do I do? That's why people find keto. That's why people find carnivore. It's why people like me have found a voice online, because these people have basically given up their responsibility to help you, the consumer. So it takes a layperson like Jimmy Moore to step up and educate and to provide information. That's a sad commentary. I'm happy because I love interacting with people and teaching and educating. That's kind of my jam. But it's sad that somebody like me has to be someone who teaches and helps get people out of that mess when they feel like they have failed because the dietary guidelines didn't work for them. That's it for this episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. As always, you can engage live in the content. Go follow me. I'm over at Instagram Live. We also simulcast on 2 Facebook pages. Thank you guys for being here as well. I'm at Living Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you are there, engage live. All these people, they will tell you this is a cool show. We have a lot of fun. If you missed it live, you can watch it on replay on Instagram for 24 hours, but we get it up on YouTube pretty fast, so go check it out. Type in a keyword Jimmy Rants on YouTube. You will find the show. Also at JimmyRants.com. We have all the past episodes, and we'd love to have you go over there and check it out. Let us know what you think, and we'll keep doing these Jimmy Rants, guys. There's too much going on in the world right now for me to be silent. So anybody that knows me knows I don't shut up. So just try to shut me up. So until next time, we'll see you then. All right.